Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today, we're going to give you something a little different. This is going to be what we're going to term a mini show. It's basically just a couple of hodgepodge topics that we're going to get John to weigh in on really quick, rapid fire, 5-minute topics. And we've got 4 of them for you today. So, first topic, John, are you ready?
No, but let's go for it.
All right. Recently, we saw WWE and UFC come together in a merger. And an interview happened shortly after that kind of flew under the radar. And I happened to see it. And I thought to myself, wow, this is a great question to ask John. So they talked about how they won't actually combine forces and become, WWE, UFC crossover fights, blah, 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 none of that. But they talked about possibly sharing a streaming platform. Is there a way you could describe that? Because they were talking about when UFC's deal with ESPN expires and when WWE's deal with NBC Universal expires. They're talking about combining forces after that. How would that look?
Well, I mean, this was one of the primary reasons the merger makes sense, because the UFC and WWE, well, WWE has a little bit of competition out there, right? They have some competition in Japan. New Japan's a pretty big promotion, my understanding. I gotta trust Dave Meltzer and Jonathan Snowden on this because I don't watch pro wrestling. But reading their Twitter and stealing what they say, that's some competition over there because they're a major promotion in Japan. They make tons of money. They also have some competition from AEW. So WWE has some competition, but UFC really has no competition in the MMA sphere. And the only real competition they have is the WWE with the networks. We saw with Fox. Fox couldn't come to terms with the UFC. They said, we're not going to meet your demands. We're going to sign WWE instead to fill your spot. So the replacement for both their products generally is the other company. And so by taking that off the table, by combining them and negotiating package deals for both of them, you basically can't play those two companies against each other. They get to be now a monopoly on both aspects of this alternative programming. You only have one option. It's them. You got to deal with this new whale is the name of the company currently. They're going to change it. Oh, I hope they change it because that's a terrible name for a company. But for now, New Whale, you're going to have to deal with New Whale only to get the either one, and they're going to charge you a heck of a lot to get both of them. So you will be the place for this guaranteed audience from both of them.
Tell me about right of first refusal. What does that mean?
Well, right of first refusal means you have to negotiate with them first. So you have to have, if you have an offer you're making, they have the right to turn it down first. So you're going to say, listen, I want any job. Let's say I was out there doing some sort of day job or whatever, and I wanted $10,000 for whatever I was doing. The person that I was currently under contract, I have to go to them first and say, I'm getting $10,000 for this, and you can meet that. It's kind of like a matching rate, but it's also like an entertainment. You have the right. Let's say I came up with a storyline, a TV show, right? You see a lot of actors have this deal with their studios, right of first refusal. If I come up with a movie idea or a TV show, I have to come present the idea first to the studio I'm signed with, and they have the right to say, we want to do this show or not. And so they have the right of first refusal.
Quick question. UFC's deal with ESPN supposedly expires in 2025. WWE's deal expires in 2026. I've always wondered this, and I've never asked you, but this is a perfect time. Is there a way they can move those dates sooner, or is that set in stone? Is there a way to negotiate those dates down?
Well, they could. Anybody can negotiate down. It'd be an agreement from the current broadcaster to say, we're going to let you out of the deal. Right. Mm-hmm. I've not heard anything about there being an option where someone can remove. Sometimes you do have that in a contract that you can exit a contract early. There might be a penalty, a fine, whatever to do that. But I haven't heard anything about that. I don't follow the WWE, so I don't know anything about their deals really. But for the UFC, I haven't heard anything about that. But you can always negotiate an early exit. I mean, Bellator did that with DAZN, and part of the reason DAZN they had to do that because DAZN was claiming poverty because of the pandemic, and they weren't going to pay them, so they did exit to go to Showtime. But you can always negotiate an exit, but you can also force them to pay up if it's not mutually beneficial.
With the UFC looking at 2025 for renewing a broadcast deal with ESPN or shopping it around, it seems to me that all of the shows at the apex, which basically are still in the bubble with a limited audience, it kind of looks like rigging the numbers for when they actually go out and have a fight night, like, Saturday or last month in San Antonio here. All of them are selling out. The pay-per-views typically sell out at the gate. So are we looking possibly at, rigging the numbers, inflating the numbers ahead of negotiations so that they look better?
Yeah, I think they're intentionally doing the events to boost the numbers, but I don't think it's for the TV deal. They're not doing it to increase value for a future TV deal. What they're doing is by holding them at the apex, they're saving money by going instead. They don't have to send the crew and spend all this money to go put an event on somewhere else. And it also limits the supply of tickets available. In other words, there's not as many shows around the country, right. And so there's a much higher demand. So people that are very passionate about the UFC and really want to see a show, there's a limited number of shows, so they're willing to drive several hours or whatever to go see that show. They can boost the ticket prices, and that's why you're seeing these massive gates, because there's a much smaller number of shows available now that they're selling tickets. And the shows that they're not selling tickets for, they're saving tons of costs by holding them in one place, so they don't have to spend travel expenses, move equipment, none of that. It's all pre-set up at the apex. So it's a money-saving venture on one side, holding the events there, and a boosting of the ticket sales on the other. But for the TV rights, I don't think that has anything to do with the boosting the TV rights. What they are doing, though, is they're boosting up the pay-per-views. They're intentionally making those more enticing. By having more fights on them, better fights, putting all the big fights on them, because they're trying to get as much pay-per-view revenue as possible to make the ESPN happy with the deal, right? ESPN makes more off the pay-per-views. And two, then that's a better negotiating thing, because they're going to sell those pay-per-views again as a block in the future.
So
Maybe they move them with.
So I was right and wrong.
Yes. We're all a little right and wrong.
Ari Emanuel said something interesting. We have a great relationship with ESPN. We love our relationship with them, and we have a year left until we can start our renewal. I think it's going to be a positive outcome for both parties, but there are a lot of buyers out there. How true is that?
It's probably very true. There's, a lot of the streaming services have expressed some interest, and he's sending the message to ESPN, you got to keep us happy. And I think from the sound of it, the theory I've heard is this is partly what PFL's counting on. PFL's counting on the fact that there might be interest, the UFC might leave ESPN, or at least threaten to. And so they're trying to set themselves up by making it that we are a possible alternative to the UFC if they leave, so ESPN can keep MMA. They haven't wasted all their time building up an MMA audience on their platform, and so they will invest more into us to keep us around, and also as a threat to the UFC. And if UFC leaves, we can take the spot like Bellator did with Spike. So I think that's partly the PFL's business, what they're hoping for. But for UFC, they have all accounts. There's Amazon, other streaming services are interested in them, and they're obviously sending a message to ESPN that they did this with Fox, they did this with Spike. We're happy with you, but we are more than willing to shop around unless you meet every demand we have and meet our price.
Do you think ESPN will be the one? Will they come back with an offer that the UFC will accept?
It depends what the UFC is asking for. I think it's very possible ESPN will, but let's say if UFC asks for a ton on the pay-per-view side, the guaranteed pay-per-views again, higher than it is now, I don't know if ESPN will go for that, because they have to get some sort of return from it. Right now, they're by all accounts I've heard, they're doing very good on the pay-per-view deal. But if UFC increases the cost a lot and we don't see a lot of pay-per-view sales, let's say the last couple of years of the deal, they might not think it's worth it. So, I imagine ESPN's, like I said, from everybody I talked to, ESPN's been happy with what they got out of the UFC in this deal. But if the UFC starts asking for a lot more, and they might start asking for a lot more, because we know Morgan Stanley says they gave 3 ranges. They, at the very least, they're going to want 50% more, and they might ask for up to 2.5 times as much on the next deal.
Oh my God.
And you're talking about right now, I think the AAV, the annual average valuation of the deal is something around, just under $500 million per year with all the streaming, the ESPN, network type deal, and the pay-per-view guarantee. Well, got 2.5 times that's a $1.25 billion deal. And I don't know anybody that's going to pay that, but if the UFC can get even 50% more, $750 million deal, close to $1 billion deal for their domestic rights here. I don't know. ESPN has got financial trouble. The streaming service hasn't been making as much as they'd hoped. I'm not sure they're going to bite the bullet and pay that, especially if Amazon or some other streaming service comes out and says they're willing to pay that kind of money for it.
Let's get a brief summary of the UFC finances, because they had released an SEC filing on Friday. I need to know.
They're doing really good. I mean, really, really good. I can't stress. Let me. I don't want to exaggerate too much, but they're doing really, 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 really good.
I want you to exaggerate. I want to know how good they're doing.
Okay, well, we have their finances came out. They filed with the SEC because of their planned merger with WWE. They have to reveal more information than they did before. Before, with Endeavor, they reveal what the segment, the owned sports properties, how they do. And we know the UFC is about 90% of that, so we get a good sense of how well they're doing. But here they're explicitly detailing the finances and financial statements, consolidated statements of the UFC. So we know when Endeavor bought UFC in 2016, the last full year of the Fertittas, they did a record $609 million in revenue. In 2020, they did $891 million in revenue. UFC. 2021. They did $1,032 million in revenue. And 2022, it went up to $1,141 million in revenue. So every year it's been going up there. Now, very much guaranteed $1 billion a year in revenue. Their media rights are now last year, their media rights and content was almost $800 million. So they are just rolling in it. And more important for them, their expenses have been basically contained. The expenses aren't growing with them. So like their operating income, which includes fighter pay, was $335 million in 2021 and $325 million in 2022. And remember, fighter pay is just a portion of that. Well, we can go on, expand on fighter pay in a second. But the big one too is their net income. And net income is synonymous with profit. Their net income went from $178 million in 2020 to $273 million in 2021 to $389 million in 2022. 34% margins.
Jesus.
And so $389 million in net income. And that's a lot of money. And it could be higher if they didn't have to pay out so much interest on loans. And part of the loans was the money they gave to the Fertittas to buy the UFC, and the loans are the money they gave basically to Endeavor to keep their business going. So the UFC, not only does it make tons of money, it's paying out a ton of money still to other people.
But not the fighters.
No, well, speaking of the fighters, last year they had an earnings call, and in that earnings call, they detailed how much the fighters made, how much growth we've seen in fighter pay from 2005 to 2021. And I calculated that, and that came out to $178.8 million for fighter pay in 2021. That might not be exact, but based on the figures they gave, that's the amount they should have paid to fighters, which is about 17.5% of revenue in 2021. Interesting enough, they note in this filing that they were able to cut fighter expenses $32.8 million from 2022 to 2021, right? That means in 2022, if my calculation was right about 2021, they paid $146 million to fighters, total pay to fighters, out of $1,141 140 million, 13% of the revenue.
13%.
13% for compensation. Now, that might not include the other stuff the UFC includes in compensation, like drug testing and the insurance policy and all these other things that they include in the compensation. But that would add about another 1.5% to their pay. So if it's not including that, they went from 13% to 14.5%.
And this down from about 17.5.
Yes, it's a pretty massive.
Oh my!
It's a pretty massive decrease, especially on a year when the revenue went up 110 million that year from the year before, and the net income, the profits went up almost 120 million.
And we're in one of the highest inflation cycles ever. Everything is expensive, and they are dropping fighter costs.
But it shows how important the content, the getting rid of the lumpiness is, because last year they didn't do great on pay-per-view. So the higher paid pay-per-view fighters that make a percent on the pay-per-view really don't make a percent. They get a bonus on the pay-per-view. They didn't get as much. So they didn't have to pay as much for those guys. They didn't have as many of them fight. But so the lesser known fighters, where they're collecting this constant guaranteed money, got paid less, and they got, and what's interesting too is that additional revenue, the amount of additional revenue. And so they made 110 million more in revenue and actually made more in net income. So basically every additional dollar is above expense. It goes right to profit.
I have a question.
I'm afraid to find this. This might be a horrifying question.
It's very roundabout. We talked about a month and a half, 2 months ago about the contract changes for intellectual property and inventions and things like that. We have them dropping costs dramatically.
Yeah.
What about if a fighter had something before they enter the contract? Let's say they have a really successful podcast. Let's say Sean O'Malley hasn't signed with the UFC, but he's super popular from the regional scene, and he's got this mega podcast that gets millions of listeners. Let's put him up there. Let's say he's given Ariel Helwani competition. If he comes into the agreement as it stands right now with all the new provisions in, but he's already got his podcast first, when he comes in, does he forfeit his podcast to them because he signed the contract?
Well, this is why I said it was going to be a horrifying question, not because it was going to be a terrible question, but it's going to bring up a horrifying idea of what the UFC can do to fighters. And fortunately, that's not the case. The UFC's contract, now, it supposedly gives them the right to any ideas and concepts and stuff while you're under contract. But they're part of the language. It's vague enough. We don't know if that means only that stuff that includes UFC branding or UFC copyright, trademark material, or can it be more wider than that, a wider net than that? I mean, it's probably intentionally vague that way. But if he comes in with a pre-existing podcast, that contract that we saw and talked about, the one we saw. Now, you might have just planted an idea in their head to put a new version in, and maybe that's going to happen. But the one that we went over a couple months ago, that does not give them the right over a podcast like that. I'd have to look through it, though. There might be some language concerning social media, what kind of social media you can do outside the UFC. So maybe in a roundabout way, the language is... there might be language in there that could limit someone's ability to hold a podcast, but I can't recall there being anything specific like that.
Ooh, small mercies there. But now I'm scared that I've poked a sleeping bear.
Yeah, look at that. In the next contract we see that as that, we'll have to call that the Steph clause.
All right. Last topic of our mini show here. Can you give a brief explanation why fighters don't have to get 3 fights a year, or the UFC has to pay them, as Dana White continuously dribbles around in his interviews?
Yeah, this is a common misconception fans have caused by the UFC, specifically Dana White bringing it up all the time, that if you don't fight, they have to give you 3 fights a year. And if you don't get 3 fights a year and fight, they have to pay you for not fighting. It doesn't quite. I mean, there's a grain of truth in there, but it doesn't work the way he's saying. And I guess it's not true. Tell you the truth, the way the contracts work. And I've read the contracts. I've asked people that are managers, attorneys, to go through the contracts, this portion with me. And all of them say the same thing to me. There's no guarantee of 3 fights a year. This is not, boxing contracts will often have that, a minimum bout guarantee. Here's the number of bouts we have to give you per year minimum, right? The UFC contracts don't include a bout minimum. There might be a few. There's supposedly a few exceptions, especially in the past, that might have had this years ago, but no longer in the standard contract. No longer. People have not heard about this for a while in the UFC. The UFC contracts basically, we're going to do a standard contract. UFC contract will say we have to give you 5 fights in 24 months, right? Usually the contract starts, at least it used to start when you signed it, right? Sometimes it might start when you get your first fight, but you get your first fight, that's 1 fight. Now, we have to offer you 4 fights over the next 24 months, right? That doesn't mean they have to give you 3 fights a year, 4 fights over the next 2 years to honor that contract. But the only limit to when they have to offer the contract, there's no language that says they have to offer you a fight this many months after a fight or this many months before. The only language is that, like, I think it's 5 weeks before a fight, they have to give you time to fill out all the forms and hand in all the paperwork and all that stuff. And so that's the only limitation to time, is they have to give you basically enough time to fill out those forms. So that's several weeks, so maybe a month or 2, to give you a fight. So they could wait a year, right? And then start offering you all the fights in the contract to honor them, to meet that agreement, to meet those 4 fights over 24 months. You're not getting 3 fights a year then. On top of that, if you can't make the fight the date they give you, for whatever reason, if you can't make it because you're injured, if you can't make it because you're sick that week or you have a wedding or whatever, you just can't do the fight, they can extend the contract. And so Francis Ngannou, remember he talked about this. They wanted to offer him a fight immediately after when he won the title, and he couldn't do it because he didn't have a visa. He had to get his visa figured out with the UFC. But they could extend the contract because of that, because he couldn't make the fight. And so it's very easy for the UFC to offer you a fight where you can't take it, or you're suspended by an athletic commission, so you really can't take it, and extend that contract. So that there's also that. Finally, if at the very end of the contract,
May I ask one thing real quick, sir?
Yep, sure.
Well, going back to what you just said, wasn't Joe Silva one that really liked to do that? Like offer fights that he knew they couldn't take?
Supposedly, yes. Supposedly, and I think there's some comment about this in the antitrust lawsuit, supposedly they almost automatically generated an extension after a fight when you got your injury suspension.
Oh my, yes.
By the they had like I don't know if an automatic. He would have people send out an automatic response to people because their injury suspension that yes, your contract's been extended because you're not available during this period. And so it was a different era. I mean, people forget the Joe Silva era was when people say, well, why don't fighters fight out their contract? During the Joe Silva era, it was nearly impossible to get out of your contract, especially after the 2008, 2009, Randy Couture and Arlovsky and those guys did get out of their contracts or try to, then they made those contracts so draconian until 2017 changes. Now we might be heading back that way. But the final thing I was saying is only after your contract is done, when I mean only after the duration, the 25 months have passed, let's say 24, 25 we said for this 5-fight deal, and all the extensions are done. If the UFC hasn't given you fights then they have to compensate you, but they only have to compensate you your base pay. There's no win bonus or anything they have to pay you, just that base pay to meet the contract. No bonuses have to be applied. So if you're a fighter that has like a $250,000 fight plus $250 to win plus pay-per-view bonus, they only have to pay up the base pay of the fights they didn't give you.
Wow. Insane. So much information in such a small space. I love our mini shows. John, what do you have coming up in the future weeks?
I don't know. That's pretty far out.
We can definitely rest assured that John will try and find himself a cat because his girlfriend took the cat back.
I don't even get visitation rights. This is just evil.
Evil. So we must rally around John and send him lots of cat pics because he needs those. He's lonesome right now.
I know, you can hold on to your cat pics, please.
John, anything else you want to talk about here? Your social media, any written articles that might be here in the past that we might not know about?
Well, I've got on Twitter. You can find me at Hey Not the Face. I've got the Hey Not the Face podcast we're doing here. I've got If the Shoes Fit. I do every 2 weeks. It's a show I do with Alexi Old, Eugene Robinson, and he will not be named, although he's not on when I'm on. It's a show. We don't talk about MMA on that show. We talk about politics and stuff. So if you want to hear my pointless commentary about that sort of non-MMA related stuff, then that's the show for you. I also do the show, the Care Don't Care show,
where you're not taking victory laps lately.
By the time this comes out, I'll have done 7 victory laps.
You will not.
I will done a lot of victory laps.
You will not.
I do that, and I'm supposed to deliver. I told Nate I will give him 2 articles per month on Bloody Elbow. So this month there should be 2 articles from me.
And you have a book coming out soon.
I wouldn't say soon. We're working on it. We're hoping to have a draft done by the end of summer. Me and Jacob Debitz, who used to write for Sherdog from Australia. He's a labor lawyer for unions over there, down there. And we are working on a book about the financial history of the UFC and kind of how it compares to, I guess we use it as an analogy too for the general economy, how what happens to the UFC is an analogy, a metaphor for the broader economy.
Awesome. Well, there you have it, folks. Our first mini-sode. You know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
It's not in the face! Thank you.